Have you ever read a book or watched a movie and wondered, what was the creator trying to say? What if I told you that doesn't even matter? Imagine Shakespeare sitting across you and telling you got it wrong about Hamlet, or Harper Lee saying your interpretation of To Kill a Mockingbird is not what I intended. Then would you change your mind? Roland Barthes, the revolutionary French theorist, says no, you shouldn't. He declares the death of the author, literally changing how we understand literature, movies, and even everyday stories. Stick around because today we are diving deep into one of the most groundbreaking ideas in literary theory. And trust me, this will forever change how you see texts. Have you ever wondered if your interpretation of a story or a movie is right or wrong? What if I told you that your perspective is just as important as what the writer intended, or even more important? Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author, flips the traditional way we think about texts. He argues that once a text is written, the author's intention no longer matter. This essay challenges us to rethink literature, films, and even how we engage with content today. So, are you ready to explore this revolutionary idea? In the 19th and the early 20th centuries, literary criticism was obsessed with the author. Critics analyzed works by digging into the author's life, beliefs, and intentions. For example, people would connect Charles Dickens's novels to his childhood struggles, or interpret Sylvia Plath's poems through her personal battles with mental health. However, when Barthes is writing in 1967, he rejected this approach. He believed that focusing on the author limits how we interpret texts. Instead, he argued that writing is an independent act that separates the text from its creator. Barthes famously declared the death of the author, saying that the meaning of a text doesn't come from the author but from the readers and the cultural context in which it is read. When Barthes says the author is dead, he means that writing erases the author's voice. Once the words are on the page, the author loses control over how the text is understood. For example, when we read Pride and Prejudice, we often forget about Jane Austen herself and focus entirely on the world of Elizabeth Bennet. Here, Jane Austen is the author and Elizabeth Bennet is the character. Barthes argues that this is how it should be. Once a story is written, the author's role is over. Now, what does Barthes mean by the death of the author? Barthes begins his essay with an example from Balzac's story, Saracen. In one passage, Balzac describes a woman's whims and emotions. Over here, Barthes asks, who is speaking here? Is it Balzac the man, the narrator of the story, or some universal idea of femininity? The point is, we can never know for sure. Barthes argues that writing is the destruction of the author's voice. Once the words are on the page, the author's intentions disappear. The text becomes independent, ready to be interpreted in countless ways. Barthes begins by challenging a traditional idea in literature, the belief that the meaning of a text comes directly from its author. For centuries, people have read books or analyzed art by trying to uncover what the author or artist intended to say. But Barthes argues that this approach is totally flawed. Once an author creates a work and puts it out in the world, their control over its meaning ends. The author metaphorically dies because their intentions, their background, and even their identity no longer matter. The text becomes independent and its meaning depends on how it is read, and interpreted. A brilliant example of this idea is William Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Written around the 17th century, The Tempest predates the emergence of post-colonialism by centuries. Post-colonialism as a theory only gained prominence in the mid-20th century, particularly in the wake of the decolonization of former colonies. Yet, despite being a product of the early 17th century, The Tempest is frequently analyzed today from a post-colonial perspective. The dynamics between Prospero and Caliban, for instance, are often interpreted as a reflection of colonial power structures, with Prospero embodying the colonizer and Caliban representing the indigenous figure. This reading highlights themes of domination, cultural erasure, and resistance, ideas that were far removed from Shakespeare's historical context but resonate deeply with modern audiences. This example underscores Barthes' argument that if we were to limit our understanding of The Tempest to Shakespeare's intention or his 17th century context, we could never explore the play's post-colonial interpretation. It is only freeing the text from the constraints of its author that it becomes a living document. It is capable of engaging with new theoretical lenses and historical contexts. Indeed, extensive research has been conducted on The Tempest through a post-colonial lens, demonstrating how literature can transcend the boundaries of time, space, and authorial intent. Similarly, Shakespeare's Macbeth remains relevant today for its exploration of ambitions and its destructive consequences, reflecting the ethical dilemmas of political and corporate power. Hamlet continues to speak to modern existential crises, while Othello addresses issues of racism and manipulation that persist in contemporary society. Shakespeare's works have transcended time, proving that great literature evolves with each generation and invites endless reinterpretation. Imagine you have written a poem about rain. For you, the rain symbolizes sadness. But when somebody reads it, they interpret rain as cleansing and hopeful. Barthes would say that their interpretation is valid because the meaning of your poem is not tied to your intention. Once the text is written, it belongs to the reader, not you. Barthes explains that this author-centric view limits the potential of a text. It puts the author at the center and forces the readers to search for the author's hidden message, biography, or psychological state. And in doing so, it closes off other interpretations and stops the text from being something greater than the author. Think of William Shakespeare's plays. For centuries, scholars have debated what Shakespeare was like as a person. Was he Catholic or Protestant? Was he in love with a man or a woman? But does knowing these details change how we experience Hamlet or Macbeth? Not really. Barthes' point is that focusing on the author distracts us from the richness of the text itself. Barthes says that the reader takes the center stage. Here's where Barthes makes his big move. He shifts the focus from the author to the reader. According to Barthes, the meaning of a text doesn't come from the writer, it comes from the reader. When you read something, you bring your own experiences, emotions, and worldview to the table. This means that every reader might interpret a text differently, and that is completely okay. The text becomes alive through these diverse interpretations. Let's take a movie like Inception. Some people think it's about the power of dreams. Others think it is about guilt and redemption. And then there are those who are obsessed with whether the spinning top falls at the end. The point is, the director's intention doesn't matter as much as what the audience takes away from the film. Think of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. It can be seen as a commentary on post-war trauma, an exploration of gender roles, or even both. And there is no wrong interpretation. Now, what does Barthes say about language? Barth argues that language itself is more important than the author. He says that it is language that speaks, not the author. But what does that mean? It means that when we write, we are using words, phrases, and ideas that already exist in the world. These are not unique to the author, they are part of a larger cultural and linguistic system. So, when you write, you are essentially rearranging ideas that have been used before. Think of T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, which depicts the spiritual and cultural decay of the 20th century Europe. Eliot starts with a striking reversal of traditional expectations in the opening line. April is the cruelest month. Normally, spring symbolizes rebirth and hope, but Eliot flips this idea. He draws from Greek mythology and literature, where seasons often carry deep symbolic meaning, to portray the modern world as one where even renewal feels cruel and unwelcome. Unlike the heroism and grandeur of ancient Greek texts like Homer's Iliad, T.S. Eliot paints a world of emptiness and despair where the richness of myth no longer provides guidance. Then there's his reference to Dante's The Divine Comedy. In the line, "I had not thought death had undone so many," Eliot borrows imagery from Inferno. In Dante's work, this describes souls in limbo caught between life and death, a state of hopeless waiting. Eliot reinterprets this to reflect the aimlessness of post-war Europe, where people seem spiritually dead, wandering without purpose or direction. It is a haunting image of a society that has lost its moral and spiritual compass. Eliot also draws from Shakespeare, particularly The Tempest. There is a line, "Those are pearls that were his eyes." It originally refers to transformation through death, suggesting beauty arising from decay. But Eliot gives it a darker twist. In The Waste Land, it evokes emptiness and futility, reflecting the disillusionment of modern existence. Shakespeare's works, though rooted in his time, are reimagined by Eliot to critique his own world, showing how timeless texts can take on new meanings. What's fascinating is how Eliot incorporates non-Western traditions as well. Towards the end of the poem, he refers to Hindu philosophy and the sacred texts of Sanskrit. He mentions the Hindu trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, symbols of creation, preservation, and destruction. He ends with the word Shanti, which means peace. And Eliot is suggesting that ancient wisdom from outside Europe might offer answers to the cultural and spiritual crisis he observes. By bringing in Eastern traditions, he broadens the scope of his critique, showing that the decay he speaks of is not just a Western problem, but a human one. Through all these references, Greek myth, Dante's visions of the afterlife, Shakespeare's plays, and Hindu philosophy, Eliot creates a fragmented yet deeply interconnected picture of a broken world. And this fragmentation reflects the very nature of post-war Europe, a society shattered by violence, disillusionment, and the loss of faith. Eliot's genius lies in how he weaves these diverse threads together, making us see that while humanity has a rich history of cultural and spiritual resources, it is up to us to rediscover their relevance and use them to rebuild meaning in a fractured modern world. This shows that literature often relies on the collective reservoir of language, culture, and ideas. The originality lies not in creating something entirely new, but in how an author rearranges and reinterprets what already exists. This reinforces Barthes' argument that meaning of a text is rooted more in the language and its cultural system than in the author's individuality. Think of the phrase, "love is blind." Thousands of writers have used it in poems, novels, and songs. But does this mean that each writer owns this idea? Of course not. Barthes argues that writing is more like weaving. It is a tissue of quotation from other texts, ideas, and culture. After this, Barthes introduces the idea of the scripter to replace the concept of the author. Unlike the traditional author, who is seen as a creator with a grand vision, the scripter is simply someone who puts words together. The scripter does not control the meaning of the text, they write, but the text's meaning emerges only when it is read. The act of writing becomes more about creating possibilities for interpretation rather than delivering a fixed message. But why is this idea revolutionary? Barthes' essay is revolutionary because it challenges centuries of literary tradition. By killing the author, Barthes gives readers the freedom to interpret texts in their own way. This approach also makes art more democratic. It acknowledges that every reader's interpretation is valid regardless of their background or expertise. Think of how fans interpret their favorite TV shows or books. Harry Potter fans, for instance, create fan theories that go far beyond what J.K. Rowling wrote. Barthes would celebrate this creativity because it shows that the readers, not the author, are giving the text its meaning. Barthes concludes by saying that the death of the author leads to the birth of the reader. This means that readers are no longer passive consumers who try to figure out the author's intent. Instead, they become active participants in creating the meaning of the text. But why Barthes' idea mattered today? Barthes' ideas go beyond literature. In today's world, memes remix existing content to create new meanings. Social media posts gain different interpretation based on how they are shared. Movies, games, and even advertisements often leave space for the audience's imagination. By shifting power from creators to audiences, Barthes encourages us to think critically about how we engage with content. Now let's discuss how Barthes' work aligns in the context of AI. Barthes' The Death of the Author marks a pivotal shift in the literary world, suggesting that once a text is written, it exists independently from the author's original intentions. The meaning of the text is not fixed, but is instead formed through the reader's interaction with it. However, in today's age, particularly with the advent of AI-generated content, we find ourselves in a post-authorial world where the very concept of authorship is being radically redefined. AI doesn't truly create in the traditional sense. It draws from an immense database of pre-existing content, recombining language, ideas, and patterns. Just as Barthes described writing as a tissue of quotations, AI's output is essentially a reworking of the linguistic and cultural material that already exists. The machine becomes a scripter, not an originator, reshaping the available data into new forms without any inherent authorial intent. This blurring of the line between the creator and reproduction complicates the dynamics of authorship in today's digital age. If AI-generated content is merely reassembled from existing material, then is it truly new? Barthes' theory of the death of the author suggests that the focus should shift from the creator to the reader, allowing for various interpretation of the text. However, in a world where AI creates vast amounts of content with no human author behind it, we might wonder who, if anyone, has the agency to interpret this material. Does the death of the author now lead to the death of human authorship altogether, leaving us to consume content that is perpetually recycled rather than created with intentionality or new meaning? Ultimately, as Barthes envisioned, the reader becomes central in interpreting the text, but in an era where AI generates this text, we must ask whether the reader's agency is diminished by the lack of an original human author. This challenges us to reconsider the role of both the creator and the consumer in shaping meaning and culture in the post-authorial age. So, with this, we wrap up The Death of the Author, written by Roland Barthes. If you think that this video has helped you in any way or the other, do like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.